In the mid-20th century, Australian journalist and reporter Rupert Murdoch became the head of his own media company. He bought several newspapers in Australia and New Zealand, and then decided to expand his business. In 1969, he acquired two popular British newspapers, The Sun and News of the World. The position of deputy chairman of the company was given to 60-year-old Alec Mackay, a man with 10 years of experience in the industry. Alec lived with his wife Muriel in Wimbledon, a fashionable suburb of London near the famous tennis club. On December 19, 1969, Rupert Murdoch and his wife Anna traveled to Australia for Christmas. During Rupert's absence, Alec Mackay took over his responsibilities. As acting company head, Alec also had the privilege of using a Rolls-Royce and chauffeur services. So on the morning of Monday, December 29th, a Rolls-Royce picked him up and drove him to work, where he remained throughout the day. That same day, 55-year-old Muriel McKay, dressed in a green wool suit, a black and white checkered coat, and cream-colored shoes, went out shopping. She returned home around 5 p.m. Alec arrived home after work at 7:45 p.m. As he approached the house, he noticed scraps of the previous day's newspaper scattered on the ground. He rang the doorbell, 3 short rings and 1 long. It was the secret code he and Muriel had devised. They had taken this precaution after a burglary in September, when thieves had broken into their home and stolen Muriel's jewelry. Along with her valuables, Muriel had lost her sense of security in her own house. Since then, she also locked the door with a chain. Yet even with that, she would never open the door unless she was certain it was Alec. When Muriel didn't answer, Alec rang again 3 times, thinking she might be upstairs. Still no reply. He turned the handle and, to his surprise, found the door unlocked. Entering the house, he saw all the lights on, but no sign of his wife. At once he noticed that a large chair had been moved away from the wall and placed in the center of the hallway. Muriel's handbag lay on the floor, its contents scattered everywhere along with more torn newspaper. On the table, Alex saw a piece of tape and a thick length of twine. The telephone had been ripped from the wall and lay overturned on the floor. At first, Alec thought burglars had once again broken in, but when he found the family's beloved dog lying in the living room in front of the open fireplace, his concern deepened. Muriel worried constantly about the dog's safety and would never have left a fire burning without the protective screen if she had gone out. Moving further inside, Alec noticed the television still on, Muriel's outdoor shoes sitting on the stairs, and her car still parked in the garage. Terrified that an intruder might still be inside and that his wife was hiding, he rushed upstairs, calling her name and checking every room. Then he searched the garage and garden. Without success, Muriel had vanished. Alec hurried to the neighbors to use their phone and report everything to the police. Officers arrived within 10 minutes and immediately noticed signs that someone had used force to push the door and to gain entry. Items found inside the house, such as the twine and tape, which did not belong to the family, painted a grim picture of what had happened. Also missing were Muriel's remaining jewelry from the previous burglary and her coat. While officers with dogs searched the grounds around the home, Alec contacted his adult children, Ian, Diane, and Jennifer. Desperate to draw as much attention as possible to his wife's disappearance, Alec reached out to the editor of The Sun, asking the paper to publish a story about Muriel's vanishing. The sensational article was rushed into print with a striking headline, but Alec's decision angered the police, who were still uncertain about how to treat the case and were not convinced a kidnapping had taken place. In the mid-20th century, it wasn't unheard of for a housewife to suddenly run away, sometimes leaving with a new lover. There was also the possibility of temporary memory loss in a 55-year-old woman. Detectives interviewed Alec and his children to determine whether Muriel's disappearance could have been a voluntary escape. They all insisted that she had always supported her husband and never opposed their move from Australia to Britain. She adored her home and garden, and she loved to spend her free time painting, showing remarkable talent. Alec told police that his wife had behaved completely normally that morning. She had even prepared dinner, clearly expecting him home. The family was convinced it was an abduction. Still, none of them could imagine a reason why anyone would target Muriel. They speculated it might have been an attempt to take revenge on Alec for something published in the newspapers. 5 hours had passed since Muriel's disappearance became known. The telephone line was reconnected, and at 1:15 a.m. it rang. Alec's son-in-law David answered. A male voice on the other end said,
"This is Group M3, the Mafia. We are from America. We have your wife. We tried to grab Rupert Murdoch's wife. We couldn't take her, so we took yours instead. By Wednesday, you must raise £1 million.
Shocked and confused, Alec tried to protest that he had no such enormous sum, but the stranger cut him off, saying it was not his concern. The operator later informed police that the call had been placed from a phone booth in Epping, about 50 kilometers northeast of Wimbledon. However, as long as the stranger's claims remained unverified, the police continued to treat the case as a disappearance rather than a confirmed abduction. They feared the caller might simply have learned about the case from the newspapers. While abduction was not ruled out, it was considered highly unlikely. Kidnapping for ransom was virtually unheard of in Britain. Rumors even spread suggesting the whole thing might have been a publicity stunt by the media magnate himself, designed to draw more attention to his newspapers. While tabloids speculated, investigators focused on the facts. They knew they had to solve the crime before inevitable copycats emerged. On December 31st, a letter arrived at the McKay family's home address. Inside the envelope was a sheet of cheap blue paper. The handwriting belonged to Muriel McKay, and it was obvious that she had written it while blindfolded. The letter confirmed that Group M3 had direct contact with the missing woman. In her note, Muriel urged her husband to cooperate with the kidnappers and asked what she could possibly have done to deserve such treatment. The postmark showed that the letter had been mailed from another suburb about 30 kilometers northeast of Wimbledon. Since the initial ransom call had been traced to Epping, investigators believed that the kidnappers, and possibly Muriel herself, were being held somewhere in the northeastern suburbs of London. After receiving the letter, the police were forced to officially declare that they were investigating the case as a kidnapping for ransom. While families around the world celebrated New Year's Eve, the McKay family waited in tense silence for Group M3 to call with instructions on how to deliver the money. Although the police tried to keep the contents of Muriel's letter hidden from the media, the McKay family believed the press could be a powerful tool to pressure the kidnappers. So they revealed everything to journalists. This decision led to an enormous, almost unbelievable flood of calls from imposters hoping to make easy money, as well as cruel pranksters. The kidnapper's voice and his insistence on calling himself M3 allowed the police to filter out some of the fake calls. Informants and undercover agents were instructed to listen carefully for any rumors about the mysterious group calling themselves the M3 Mafia. The police received hundreds of tips, both from informants and from ordinary citizens, including one from a Wimbledon resident who recalled seeing a dark-colored Volvo with two men inside slowly circling the neighborhood at 4:40 p.m. on the day of Muriel's disappearance. Later that same evening, around 6 p.m., another neighbor noticed that the lights were on in the McKay home and a dark-colored car was parked in their driveway. 8 days after the last call from M3, another letter arrived, marked urgent and personal. Written on a sheet torn from a school notebook, M3 complained that they had been unable to reach Alec because the telephone line was always busy. They stated they would provide instructions for the exchange once the police were withdrawn. After 4 days of silence, on January 14th, the kidnappers called again, promising to give what they considered proof that Muriel was still alive, a description of the coat she had been wearing on the day of the abduction. But the family was not convinced that this proved anything at all. The M3 representative then promised that Muriel would write another letter. The next conversation took place 5 days later, on Monday, January 19th. It lasted 45 minutes, the longest call during Muriel's disappearance. Alec demanded proof that Muriel was alive, suggesting she should write the full names of their children or describe the Christmas presents she had recently received. M3 brushed off his request, assuring him that his wife was alive and that he would be allowed to speak with her only after half the ransom had been handed over. On January 22nd, the family received 2 more letters. They were sent from Wood Green, another suburb in northeast London. Both were written by Muriel and addressed to Alec and Diane. Again, she pleaded with her husband to cooperate, while in the letter to her daughter, she urged her to persuade Alec not to work with the police, mentioning she had seen Diane on a news program. This comment immediately raised suspicion. Diane had only spoken once to journalists, on the day after her mother's disappearance. It seemed strange that Muriel would mention it 23 days later. Detectives began to suspect that Muriel had been forced to write all the letters long ago and that they were being mailed out gradually to create the illusion she was still alive. Along with the letters came the first detailed ransom instructions, setting the exchange date for February 1st. £500,000 was to be placed in a suitcase and transported in Muriel's car along the North Circular Road to a phone booth on Cambridge Road. At exactly 10 p.m., M3 would call that phone box with further directions. During the next conversation with M3, Ian told them they had gathered 250,000 pounds, but insisted they needed proof that Muriel was alive, saying he wanted to speak with her. Once again, the kidnappers refused. In desperation, Ian suggested they buy an evening newspaper and have Muriel copy out the headlines. 3 days later, another letter arrived from Wood Green. Inside were handwritten notes from Muriel, but none contained newspaper headlines. Instead, they almost repeated the previous letters. The envelope also contained 3 small squares of fabric, cut from the clothing Muriel had been wearing on the day of her disappearance, trimmed so precisely it seemed the work of a skilled tailor. 2 days before the scheduled ransom drop, Ian discussed the final details with the kidnappers. They appeared resigned to the fact they would not receive the full £1 million and agreed to settle for half. Ian offered to use the Rolls-Royce with a chauffeur, explaining he could not drive due to a hand injury. M3 accepted, unaware that Ian's story was a lie. In fact, the police had devised a plan. 2 undercover officers would pose as Ian and the chauffeur, with a hidden radio inside the car. At 9 p.m., the Rolls-Royce left the McKay home, carrying a suitcase filled with £500,000, mostly fake banknotes with only a thin layer of real currency on top. Inside was also a tracking device. The car stopped at the phone booth. Exactly at 10 p.m., the phone rang. M3 directed the man to another phone booth, a 40-minute drive away, where he found a discarded cigarette packet containing instructions. The suitcase was to be delivered to a corner of Cambridge Road. 2 paper flowers would be sticking up from the pavement, marking the spot where the case should be left. The officer followed the instructions and returned to the phone booth, where M3 promised to call back with Muriel's location. More than 100 police officers were secretly watching the suitcase, with 40 in bulletproof vests. If Muriel and her captor appeared, they were prepared to throw her to the ground and shield her while the rest of the team arrested the kidnapper. 3 officers noticed a dark blue Volvo with 2 men inside, circling the area. No one noted the license plate, assuming it was just one of the many police vehicles on the perimeter. Hours passed, but no one came for the suitcase, and at 3:30 a.m., the operation was called off. 2 days later, an M3 representative phoned again, telling Ian the police presence had been far too obvious. The kidnapper said he now had to meet with mafia bosses to decide Muriel's fate, yet only 2 hours later, he called back, apparently calmer. M3 were willing to attempt another exchange, but this time the money must be delivered by Alec and Diane. They no longer trusted Ian, whom they suspected of arranging the police presence. The ransom was to be split into 2 suitcases. On February 6th at 4 p.m., Alec and Diane were to drive the Rolls-Royce to a phone booth and wait for instructions. Again, 2 disguised undercover officers, a man and a woman, took their places in the car. After a series of phone booth visits, they were directed by train to Epping, and from there by taxi to Bishop's Stortford, 40 kilometers northeast of central London. The suitcases were to be left beside a minivan parked near a specific garage. 5 minutes after the drop, the undercover officers noticed a Volvo with a broken rear light slowly passing the minivan. The driver stared fixedly at the suitcases before driving off. Over the next few hours, until 10:47 p.m., the Volvo drove past 3 more times, but the driver never dared stop to pick up the money. At 11 p.m., 2 local residents noticed the abandoned suitcases and, unaware of the secret operation, reported them to the police. To the horror of the undercover team, uninformed local officers simply collected the cases and drove away, abruptly ending the mission. But all was not lost. The police now had a crucial lead. The dark Volvo had been seen at both ransom drop attempts, and a similar car had been spotted by neighbors on the day Muriel was abducted. While this detail had been overlooked the first time, the second sighting allowed officers to record its registration number, XGO 994G. On the morning of February 7th, after 40 days of searching for Muriel, police arrived at a farm in the village of Stocking Pelham, Hertfordshire, about 50 kilometers northeast of London, the area from which M3 had been operating. Parked outside was the dark blue Volvo with a broken headlight. The car was registered to the wife of the farm's owner, 34-year-old Arthur Hossain, an Indian-born immigrant from Trinidad. After moving to London in 1955, Arthur had worked as a tailor until he was drafted in 1960. Unwilling to serve, he deserted and was imprisoned. During this time, he met a hairdresser 10 years older than him, whom he soon married. Arthur's tailoring business brought in some income, but he wanted more. He took out a loan to buy a farm. In late 1969, his younger brother, 21-year-old Nizamuddin Hossein, moved in to help on the farm while Arthur's wife Elsa and their children visited relatives in Germany. The brothers were very different, both in appearance and temperament. Though the younger appeared stronger, he had a pliant, submissive character, and Arthur easily dominated him. Police quickly identified Nizamuddin as the driver of the Volvo and Arthur as the passenger. Inside the farmhouse, they found a trove of evidence linking the brothers to Muriel. Tape and twine matching those discovered at the McKay residence. 6 paper flowers, a school notebook missing pages used for Muriel's letters, and the same brand of cigarettes as the packet left in the phone booth. Fingerprints on the packet matched Arthur's, while his handwriting corresponded with the ransom notes. The voice of Nizamuddin clearly matched the man who had called as M3. Even more damning, in Nizamuddin's trouser pocket, they found a scrap of paper with the number of the minivan parked by the Bishop's Stortford garage, exactly where the ransom was supposed to be delivered. Another indirect but powerful sign that the police had the right men was the sudden silence. For 40 days, the kidnappers had made 18 phone calls and written 5 letters. After the raid on the farm, not a single word was heard from them again. The Hossein brothers were arrested. By then, detectives were convinced the men were guilty not only of kidnapping, but also of Muriel McKay's death. The next challenge was to find her. For weeks, police searched the farm, but found no trace of the missing woman. The case became a media sensation, with the public questioning how a jury could convict someone of murder without a body. The trial began on September 14, 1970. Both brothers denied involvement and blamed each other. However, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against them, enough to prove both were guilty, even if one had been led by the other. In court, it emerged that the brothers had devised their plan in late October 1969 after seeing Rupert Murdoch interviewed on television. They were struck by his mention of the huge financial outlay required for his purchase of the British newspapers News of the World and The Sun. Fixated on Murdoch's wealth, they concocted a plan to kidnap his young wife Anna, believing he would pay handsomely for her safe return. But their plan was sloppy, and mistakes were inevitable. The Hosseins followed Murdoch's Rolls-Royce, believing that they had located Anna's residence. They had no idea that Murdoch and his wife had flown to Australia for the holidays, and the car was instead being used by Alec McKay. Breaking into the house, they realized their mistake, but decided not to abandon their plan. Instead, they abducted Muriel. On October 6, 1970, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found both brothers guilty. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. Arthur later filed appeals and fought for parole, but died in prison in 2009. Unlike his brother, Nizamuddin was released after 20 years and deported to Trinidad, where he vanished from public record. Thus ended the story of loving wife and mother Muriel McKay, torn from the safety of her own home by a cruel mistake and thrust into horror and despair.